The Summer Games Minute, brought to you by Mass Mutual. It is one of the most coveted trophies in the world, but are gold medals really gold? Well, mostly, they're not. The gold medals given out these days are nearly entirely silver and are plated with pure gold to give them that iconic sheen. Silver medals are, of course, made with silver, and bronze medals are a combination of copper and other metals like tin or zinc. And while winning an Olympic medal is priceless, the value of the materials in the medal are not. In recent games, some of the materials used to make the medals have come from recycled cell phones. Mass Mutual celebrates women's sports history and understands the nuances in how women want and need to manage their finances. With quality product solutions and guidance, a Mass Mutual financial professional can help you plan for both short-term and long-term money goals. Learn more and get started at massmutual.com.
The Athletic. Hello and welcome to another episode of And Colossally, That's History. I'm Matt Bishop.
And I'm Richard Williams.
And we'd like to welcome you to part 2 of what is a 3-part mini-series on the 1994 San Marino Grand Prix at Imola. Now, on the last episode, we set the scene, didn't we, for F1's, Formula One's so-called blackest weekend, and we went into detail not only on the lay of the land in the World Championship, heading into round 3 of that year's race calendar, because Imola was round 3, but we also talked about how safety and indeed attitudes to safety had evolved to that point.
Yes, we did. And we did that so that this time we could go straight into what actually happened during the weekend, that horrible weekend at Imola in late April and early May of 1994. There's a lot to cover. But if you want to know the background to everything we're going to be talking about, we might advise you to go back and listen to the previous episode first, so you can get a bit more context.
Far be it for us to recommend you re-listen to our stuff, but yes, it might well be a good idea. So, yes, indeed, we're going to go over now the details of that weekend. Pour over the details, I think we could fairly say, chronologically from start to finish. But I think I have to say, just to warn you, I'm afraid there really are some rather grim details. 2 people killed, several others badly injured. Richard, it was one of those events where nearly everything that could have gone wrong did go wrong, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was a race meeting that seemed to go from one disaster to another. In a way, it seemed to unfold in slow motion, like a kind of 3-day catastrophe. And there was an atmosphere of dread hanging over the whole weekend. I was very struck by 2 things that were said afterwards. The journalist David Tremaine called it the weekend when God turned his back. And Murray Walker described it as the blackest day for Grand Prix racing that I can remember.
He did indeed. So let's start from the top, shall we, Richard?
Sure.
Okay, so, Benetton's Michael Schumacher came into the race, and of course that was round 3 of the 1994 Formula One World Championship, with a lead, 13 points, I think, in the drivers' standings, over a little-known fact, anorak fact, as I would call it on Twitter, actually, over Jordan's Rubens Barrichello, who was rather surprisingly second, and Williams Damon Hill a further point behind. Now, Ayrton Senna, who was the pre-season favourite, because, of course, Williams had been so dominant in the previous 2 years, so Ayrton, in a Williams, of course, 3-time world champion himself, he'd scored pole positions in both of those first 2 races for Williams.
Yes, but Ayrton was also deeply suspicious by that point that Benetton and Michael Schumacher were using illegal traction control systems.
He absolutely was. And so the Williams was fast, and he was fast in it, but he was, as you say, very suspicious. He didn't buy it. I mean, it's a separate conversation which we won't go into in huge detail, but perhaps we'll be talking about in another podcast, the 1994 season in its entirety. But anyway, that was the situation heading into Friday at Imola, which was the first day of track action. Just, if I may say so, those of you listening who weren't watching Formula One at the time may not know that in those days qualifying took place over 2 sessions, one on Friday and one on Saturday, and the best times over those 2 sessions settled the grid. And it was actually, Richard, wasn't it? It was actually in that first qualifying session on Friday afternoon that we had our first horrible moment.
Yes, if you remember, Michael Schumacher set the initial pace, but his lap time had just been beaten by Senna when Rubens Barrichello crashed horribly at the Variante Bassa corner at the end of the lap. Rubens was just a couple of weeks short of his 22nd birthday, and this was his second season in F1. When he'd come in the year before at Kyalami in his first race, Ayrton had gone along to the Jordan pit to say hello and welcome him to F1, as they were both natives of Sao Paulo. Rubens had done reasonably well. He'd scored a couple of points in Japan that season, but he began the new season really well, 4th at Interlagos, and then 3rd, Jordan's first podium, at Aida. And he was out on his first flying lap at Imola when he had his horrible accident. If you remember, the car hit the exit curb coming out of the corner and was launched into the air. And it kind of barrel rolled along, hitting the tyre barriers more than a metre off the ground and decelerating extremely fast and rolling a few times.
Yeah. Just a horrible crash, wasn't it? Just a horrible crash. And he was very lucky to get out of it, basically unhurt.
He was. Gary Anderson, who designed the Jordan, told him much later that he'd looked at the telemetry and he'd actually gone into the corner 8 kilometres an hour faster, 5 miles an hour faster than on any of his previous laps. So Rubens thought, well, maybe I was being a bit overconfident. But anyway, he was really lucky once the accident had happened and he was sitting there in the car that the F1 doctor, Professor Sid Watkins, got there very quickly and discovered that Rubens was choking to death because he'd swallowed his tongue. So it is, I believe, a fairly simple medical procedure to open the mouth, hook the tongue out and pull it back out of the throat. And he got him breathing again. And then, of course, he was taken by air ambulance to the Maggiore Hospital in Bologna, which had become more familiar as the weekend went on. Where he was diagnosed with a broken nose and a fractured rib. As you said, he was really lucky. Really lucky.
And of course, we didn't then know that this was but episode 1 in what was going to be a ghastly series of similar accidents. Anyway, he was certainly lucky. And I actually noted, here's what he remembered about what happened when he woke up in his hospital bed. Which would have been on the Friday afternoon. I've got the quote here. I've made a note of it. He said, "The first face I saw was Ayrton's, with tears in his eyes. I had never seen that with Ayrton before. It was as though my accident had happened to him." What a good quote that is. And as you'll see and hear, I think the whole weekend, as I say, was imbued with that kind of emotion. And of course, Ayrton was... Well, he was an emotional man, as is Rubens, and both of them deeply religious, weren't they?
Yes, they were. Yep.
Yeah. Anyway, qualifying did resume, and as you'd expect, Senna went quicker still. Although, if I remember rightly, he and Schumacher both spun, which I think proved, again, maybe they were fast cars, the 1994 cars, but they were tricky. They were tricky to handle. But... I wasn't actually at Imola that weekend. I didn't go to all the races in 1994. I went to some, but not all. So, Richard, what was Senna's mood on that Friday evening? We mentioned on the last podcast the, emotional, brooding, almost unsettlingly intense photos of Senna that were being taken in the garage that weekend. But was that typical?
Yeah, there's no doubt Senna had a lot more than usual on his mind that weekend. There'd been a lot of activity away from the track. I'd actually seen him 10 days earlier. I'd gone to Paris.
Had you?
Yeah, to see Paris Saint-Germain play a friendly football match against the Brazil national team, who were warming up for that year's World Cup finals. And this was just a friendly. But Senna was there. He'd been invited along to kick off the game, which he did. And looking perfectly cheerful and happy, and of course, a nice thing to do. And the Parc des Princes in Paris, there were an awful lot of Brazilians present, and it was a very dull 0-0 draw. And afterwards, in the corridors under the grandstands, the poor Brazil manager, Carlos Alberto Pereira, was absolutely mobbed by the 60 Brazilian journalists who'd come over to watch the match, and they were all asking him, how on earth are you going to win the World Cup with this lot? And I got an idea then of what it must be like for someone representing Brazil in sport to have 250 million fans on your shoulder.
Because he, of course, Nigel Mansell represented the UK and Alain Prost represented France, but not quite in the same way.
No. Brazil, a Brazilian said to me later, this is a third world country. We need our heroes in a different way than you do. And that was a good example to me of what that meant, of the pressure that it could heap on you. Anyway, the day before he got to Imola, he'd also been at the launch of a mountain bike, and he got to the circuit with the head of the Ducati motorbike firm and Tag Watches, both of whom were making products bearing his name. There was really a lot of commercial stuff going on. And his brother Leonardo was with him, which was one reason his girlfriend, I don't know if you remember her, Adriana Gallisto.
I
do. Actress, model. It's one of the reasons why she wasn't at Imola. She'd just flown back to Europe from Brazil, but instead of going to join him at Imola, she'd gone down to their home in Faro in Portugal, because the Senna family didn't approve of his plans to marry her.
Why did they not?
Probably she wasn't posh enough. They were sort of upper middle class, wealthy family. She didn't come from that kind of background. That might have been it. He'd been going out with a singer called Xuxa.
I remember her.
Yeah. Who was she was the sort of Madonna of Brazil.
Didn't they meet on a talk show or a chat show?
I think they did. That's right. Where yes, he was asked to kiss her, and he was rather
and he obliged.
He did, but in a rather embarrassed way. Anyway, they went out, and I think the family liked her. That could be seen later on, actually, at the funeral. So anyway, there were all sorts of things going on for him, but the biggest thing that weekend, when he got to the Williams garage, was to ask about the car, the FW16B, and the problems he'd been having to face at Interlagos and Aida. There were 2 DNFs for him and 20 points for 2 wins for Michael Schumacher. And I will never forget that the British weekly Autosport had a cover in the week of Imola with the headline, "Senna, can he take the heat?" Well, I thought, gosh, that's, he's a triple champion. That might be a slightly discourteous thing, maybe, to say. But anyway, that's an indication.
But not inaccurate, actually. I know it was a question, but perhaps a prescient one.
Maybe, maybe in hindsight, particularly. Yeah. Maybe. Yeah. Maybe, anyway. That's what was going on. And there'd been a lot of head-scratching and deep discussions with Adrian Newey, who designed the car. They'd made some modifications, particularly to the front end, the wing, and the wheelbase. And Senna wanted to find out if those changes would make any difference. The car was handling very unpredictably. He was very uncomfortable in the cockpit. Changes had been made to the steering column. Adrian Newey always designs cars. He wraps them around the driver very tightly. And Senna had definitely found himself uncomfortable to begin with, and he was hoping for changes there. So he had a lot to think about, and even before the crashes in qualifying brought safety to the forefront of his mind.
Absolutely, certainly was the case, yes. And, let's go into Saturday, I think now. We've done the background. Obviously, we'd had Barrichello's shunt, but he returned to the track. I mean, amazing, really. With a plaster over his broken nose, I remember, and even his arm in plaster. It appeared at that point, it appeared to us all that Formula One had had yet another lucky escape. And Rubens was the walking, talking, driving proof of that lucky escape. But the relief didn't last because, well, bit of background. In 1994, there were 28 cars, by the way, completely separate aside, but I'm going to say it because I firmly believe it, which shows that the Andretti team should be allowed into Formula One.
Excellent point, and you're certainly allowed to make it.
Well, in 1994, there were 28 cars fighting for 26 places on the grid, which of course meant that there were always effectively two teams, the two least competitive teams, fighting to make the grid. And those two teams were Simtech and Pacific, both new teams. Driving for Simtech were David Brabham, obviously the son of legendary three-time Australian world champion, Formula One three-time world champion Jack Brabham, and Roland Ratzenberger, a 33-year-old Austrian he'd also, not that many people who weren't involved in the sport probably knew an awful lot about him. And in fact, if you ask people about Roland Ratzenberger, probably most fans now only know one thing about him, which is a sad thing. Anyway, he'd won races in British and Japanese Formula 3000, and actually he'd won, if I'm not mistaken, Richard, he'd won his class at Le Mans. He hadn't won it outright, but he'd won his class.
He also won the Formula Ford Festival a few years before.
Another very good anorak fact, Richard.
Yeah, and that was a big thing at the time.
It was at the time.
It meant you were a coming man. You were a
Yes.
star of the future. It was won by lots of good people like Johnny Herbert, for instance.
Absolutely.
And so he was known to British fans
Yes.
through that.
I never met him. You probably met him, did
Not
you?
really, sort of glancingly, but everybody said... everybody felt very warmly towards him. And
Lovely man.
And that wasn't something that came up just after he was killed. It wasn't just a reaction
Absolutely.
to that. I think he was genuinely a nice man.
I think people did often use the phrase lovely man. He was a lovely man. Anyway, he arrived at Imola, on the back foot because he'd been devastated to miss the cut in Brazil because his car was not one of the 26 that made it. But he did make the grid for the Pacific Grand Prix in Japan, Aida, where he'd finished it too. He finished 11th. Now, obviously, the Simtech, brand new team, not a quick car. And Ratzenberger had issues, I think, with the car's brakes on that first day at Imola. So after what the team boss, Nick Worth, says, I think he described it as some soul-searching, on Friday night, Ratzenberger, he went into Saturday's qualifying absolutely desperate to get onto the grid. And he did. He did indeed set a time quick enough to scrape onto the final row of the grid. Ironically, and now I suppose you might say tragically. But then, as he was pushing harder still to improve that time, he flew off the road at the Villeneuve corner, actually, and hit the wall head-on at terrifying speed.
Yes, his front wing had failed on the approach to the kink, probably because he'd hit the curb on the previous lap and the retaining bolts had come loose. That seems to be what had happened. Nothing definitive was established. So at that point, he was a passenger as he hit the wall, actually at a 50-degree angle, and he went in at about 180 miles an hour. And the car slid along the barrier, disintegrating all the way to the left-hander at Tosa. And you can see, if you watch the film, you can see when the first safety workers arrived at the car, you can see it's bad because they don't know what to do.
Yeah, body language is so revealing, isn't it,
is.
with the marshals and emergency workers.
And Ratzenberger is still sitting in the cockpit, but his head was sort of slumped forward and in a very telling way. And he was taken from the track to the hospital again by the air ambulance. And he wasn't declared dead until he got to the hospital.
Well, you kind of can't be in Italy, can you, for complicated legal reasons?
You can't. If the fatality is declared at the track, then the track has to be closed immediately, the whole circuit, for the investigations to start.
It becomes a crime scene.
It does, effectively.
Yeah.
And this, of course, had some bearing on events later in the weekend. But that's also what happened with Ratzenberger. The official cause of death was a fracture at the base of the skull, but he had a ruptured aorta and several other very serious injuries, so he died instantly. And so he became the first fatality during an F1 race weekend since Riccardo Paletti died in Canada in 1982, and the first death in an F1 car since Elio De Angelis during testing at Paul Ricard in 1986, when it became apparent that it was necessary to have much better medical precautions and facilities at test sessions as well as races.
Absolutely. I mean, terrible, terrible thing, Ratzenberger. Anyway, let's roll on with what happened at Imola in 1994, because the next thing that happened was Bernie Ecclestone, obviously commercial rights holder, the boss of Formula One, very much so at that time, confirmed to the Simtech boss, Nick Worth, that Ratzenberger had died. And the paddock was consumed by grief. You know, as you say, Richard, it hadn't happened. A death hadn't happened actually at a Grand Prix meeting. I know De Angelis had died in testing, but it hadn't happened at a Grand Prix meeting for 12 long years. Perhaps people were just lulled into a sense of false security about that. I don't know. But anyway, no one was more upset, were they, than Ayrton, who, if we remember, I think, if I'm not mistaken, he'd perhaps rather eerily had predicted before the season that he feared there might be some serious accidents in 1994 because of the regulation changes.
Yeah, because the cars would become trickier, lacking...
Which they were.
Of course, lacking their active suspension, and, you know, the ABS was starting to come in, and automated gear changing, all kinds of things. And so they were going to be harder to handle, and he'd foreseen that. He
did, and of course he watched Ratzenberger's crash on the monitors in the Williams garage. And I think I've seen, probably a lot of people listening have seen the footage of him just shaking his head and walking out of the garage. And then he went to the site of the accident.
Yeah, he got some fire marshals to take him there in their official car.
And he went down and looked at it and inspected it and had a moment, I suppose. Yeah. He had a lot of moments that weekend. We can say that. I mean, even before his final moment. So he went and spent time there. And then he sought out his friend, Professor Sid Watkins, Prof, who was a friend of his, not just the Formula One doctor. And I think, if I'm right in saying, their encounter was, well, a tearful one, wasn't it?
Yes, I think it was a very intense one. Senna had gone fastest in both qualifying sessions, and he'd taken pole for the third race in a row, despite all the problems with the car and the terrible mood. But he told Sid Watkins that he didn't want to take part in the race. I should think that was probably something he'd never said to anybody before in his entire career. And then there was a famous exchange between the two. Sid Watkins, who knew him very well, said, "Well, what else do you need to do? You've been world champion 3 times. You're obviously the quickest driver in the world. Give it up and let's go fishing."
Because they enjoyed fishing together. Yeah.
And Senna replied, "Sid, there are certain things over which we have no control. I can't quit. I have to go on."
And it's interesting to know why he said that. I mean, obviously he was contracted, and we all know that motor racing is dangerous, and it was the same for everyone. But I think he probably had a more kind of primordial drive to perform, and there was honor, and there was national pride, and perhaps even religious aspects to it.
Yeah, all kinds of things. But I have to say, bottom line, he's a racing driver.
Yeah.
And that's, you alluded to that, and that's what they do.
They do. But I do think several drivers actually questioned whether they wanted to race the following day. Perhaps not all of them said so. But I think Gerhard Berger said so. Of course, he was Austrian, like Ratzenberger. And I think I remember him saying the accident had made him feel sick. Not surprisingly. But yes, as you say, Richard, on race day, they did race, because that's what racing drivers do. Actually, I spoke to David Brabham about it just the other day, in fact, just the other day. And of course, the relevance here is that David was Roland's teammate at Simtech. And even now, 30 years later, David, well, if I'm not being too indiscreet, he began to well up as he talked about it, about Roland, about the fact that their tiny little brand new team, Simtech, was suddenly in the global media spotlight in, the most unbearably painful way. And not just the sporting media, but all the media looking at little old them, tiny little Simtech. And don't forget, Roland's parents had always been, pretty dead set against him going racing because of the danger, especially his father. And now this happened. I mean, David told me he wondered whether he should race the next day or not, because, of course, there was a worry that maybe the fault on the car that had caused the shunt to Roland, maybe that fault might also, be present on David's car.
And Simtech was an unproven team at that point, wasn't
Completely
it?
brand new.
Yeah, nobody really knew what their value was, what their worth was, what the integrity of their car was.
Yes, and brand new, on a shoestring.
Yep.
No engineering integrity or reputation of engineering integrity to fall back on. So anyway, he did the warm-up, gently at first. Then he began to push a bit because he's a racing driver. And he decided, this is David, of course, David Brabham, he decided, okay, I'll do it. And I think that was brave. But then David is brave. He's a brave guy, a gritty guy. And of course, more than many, he was born to race, being the son of one of the greatest and grittiest. Well, he was gritty, Sir Jack Brabham, wasn't he?
Jack, he was, yes.
He was gritty.
Not least in the grit he threw up from the curbs in the faces of other drivers.
Deliberately.
Yeah.
So Jim Clark's following me. I think I'll go over a few stones here.
But gritty indeed.
Gritty indeed. Gritty in every sense of the word. Anyway, when it came to it, on the Sunday at Imola, they all raced. They all raced because the show must go on is the phrase, I think. And we'll cover the events of that fateful race day in just a moment in part 2.
We love talking stats here at The Athletic. Here's one that's super simple to remember. Discover automatically doubles the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cash Back Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. That's right. You could put it towards some memorabilia you've had your eye on or treat yourself to a premium sports network. You earn and Discover doubles. See terms at discover.com/credit card.
As you said just before the break, Matt, despite all his inner turmoil, Senna decided, like all the other drivers, to race in Sunday's Grand Prix.
Yeah.
But before that, 2 rather important things happened. First, he met Alain Prost, his old rival, not once but twice. Prost had retired the year before as world champion, was there to commentate for French TV, and Senna had gone looking for him in the TV compound. And he actually spoke to him again in the Williams garage.
Interesting that he should do that because they weren't mates, let's put it that way.
They certainly weren't. Of course, we have only Prost's testimony as to what happened at these meetings. So we have to bear that in mind a bit, I think. But he did say that, again, according to him, the conversations they had were about safety and improving it, and also about Senna's concerns about Michael Schumacher's Benetton and whether it was legal or not. But it's certainly interesting, whatever the warmth of their rapprochement, that Senna should have gone looking for him to have conversations about very important subjects.
I suppose he just thought, whatever I think of Prost, this guy knows about Formula One. He's a person I can seek out and seek counsel from.
Yeah, some people in sport always say if you have a bitter rivalry, a long bitter rivalry with someone, that person, he or she, is the person you're closest to in the end. You may hate each other, but there is a kind of special.
It's a kind of Ali Frazier type of dynamic.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So the other thing that happened is that despite it all, Senna still went fastest in the pre-race warm-up by nearly 0.9 of a second, which says something about how he could tune out all the noise when there was a job to be done.
Indeed it does. It also says, if I can reuse a phrase I've already used, but I used it about David Brabham, Senna was born to race. Born to race. And even though he was sad, even though he was, I don't know, perhaps confused, conflicted, even though he was even a bit angry, I think, is not an inappropriate word to use.
Oh, I think he was certainly angry with the car.
Yeah.
He was really angry that he'd gone to Williams, which had been such a dominant team, expecting to find something similar, and then walking into what seemed to be a terrible car.
And
anger, I'm sure, was there.
Anger was there, but I think he was also angry, not necessarily blaming anyone, but angry about the death. You know, he was in an unhappy, fractious mixture of negative emotions,
and didn't quite know what he was racing against either in the shape
because of the Benetton.
Yes.
So he still, despite all of that, he still did what no one in the world at that time knew how to do better than he did, which is to turn a super fast lap. And that's what he did, because that's who he was. Anyway, moving on with our narrative, the other pre-race incident of note was the drivers got together at the drivers' briefing and they reformed the GPDA, the Grand Prix Drivers Association, which of course had started years before with Jackie Stewart and others and Graham Hill.
Yeah, before that even.
Joe Bonnier.
Moss, Salvadori, Brooks. Those guys were in it at the end of the 50s.
But it had gone into abeyance for a while.
Yeah.
Anyway, it was reformed, and I think, if I remember, the directors were Senna, Schumacher, and Gerhard Berger.
Yes, and I think it had gone into abeyance, as you say, because everybody assumed that motor racing was now
not necessarily
relatively safe.
Yes, exactly. It was a thing that one needed in the 50s and 60s, but not now.
Yep.
Anyway, that wrong theory was brought crashing down because of the tragedies of Imola 1994. And isn't it a strange thing? Those three directors of the GPDA, Senna, Schumacher and Berger, qualified 1, 2 and 3 for the 1994 San Marino Grand Prix. So they lined up first, second and third on the grid. Right, so we're moving into the race. And it was dry and sunny, thank goodness. But nonetheless, there was, as I say, I wasn't there, but there was a distinctly uneasy atmosphere. People who were there have always told me. I'm talking about drivers, journalists, photographers, team people. There wasn't there?
A heavy atmosphere, I think you would say. Unusually heavy,
And it wasn't helped. That atmosphere, of course, wasn't helped when, at the start, guess what? We had another huge shunt, didn't we? A huge shunt when J.J. Leto in the other Benetton, who, by the way, had missed the first 2 races of the season through injury. And here's another strange thing. He'd actually travelled to Imola from Monaco with his friend. And his friend was Roland Ratzenberger. Anyway, JJ stalled on the grid and was hit from behind by Pedro Lami's Lotus,
who'd come from several rows behind and was completely unsighted as
so
cars were moving around Leto's stall car, and Lamy was travelling when he hit the back of it.
Exactly. So in fact, although it didn't end up with a fatality, it was not very unlike the accident that had killed Riccardo Paletti in Montreal 12 years before.
When he ran into the back of Pironi, I think it was.
Exactly, it was. Anyway, as I say, both drivers on this occasion, Leto and Lamy, were unharmed. Although a wheel from Lamy's car flew over the catch fencing and into a spectator area, where I think it was a copper, a policeman, and 3 spectators were injured. I mean, there was just so much going on, shunt-wise, if I may put it that way. But it could have been so much worse, couldn't it, Richard?
Yes, it could. It happened opposite the pits and beside a grandstand, and that wheel flying off could have gone anywhere. And there was a lesson there, of course. Don't let wheels fly off. The race director's response was to send out the safety car, which was still a novelty in 1994, and it had come into F1 from IndyCar racing.
Yeah.
Today, with 2 wrecked cars and a lot of debris on the track near the start line, the race would have been red flagged immediately, and there'd be and there'd be a proper restart, a standing start from a reformed grid. But not back then. The safety car went out, and it was an Opel Vectra.
Vauxhall Vectra to Brits listening.
Indeed. What do they have as a safety car today? Do they have
They have Mercs and Aston
Martins, and they're quick, and
they're quick.
And they're tuned. But this was an Opel Vectra. And that directly spoke to the concerns that Senna had been expressing before the race, particularly when he'd been talking to Berger, that the safety car wouldn't be able to go fast enough to allow the drivers to keep their tyres warm and the tyre pressures high. And it was later revealed that the safety car's brakes had started fading on its first lap.
First lap, imagine.
Yep. And so the driver had to reduce his own speed in order to avoid having an accident of his own while he was at the head of 26 Formula One cars.
It wasn't, if I may say so, it wasn't really taken...
24 Formula One cars, I beg your pardon, because 2 of them were wrecked on the start line.
Quite right,
Sorry.
quite right, yes, sorry. It wasn't really taken seriously, the safety car. I mean, the safety car was just a car.
Yep.
Nobody thought that it needed to be a fast car and driven fast by an ex-racing driver. Often an ex-racing driver got the gig, but it wasn't the same scientific approach to keeping the pace up. And actually, one theory had it that the safety car in this case was so slow, and the tyre temperatures of the following Formula One cars, temperatures and pressures actually, then became so low also, therefore, that the ride heights dropped slightly, correspondingly lowered. And that, of course, would mean, I'm not saying this is the case, and we won't go into the whole whys and wherefores and causality of the shunt at this stage, we'll do that later. But since you've mentioned the safety car, one of the theories at the time, I remember, was that the thought was that the cars were lower because of the lower temperatures and pressures of the tyres, and therefore weren't able to pass cleanly over the shards of car bits, other bits of car debris that had been left by all the previous shunts, because not all of it had been swept away by the marshals. Much as possible, but not absolutely all. Of course, we'll never really know. There are many theories, and as I say, we'll talk about them probably in the next episode. Anyway, back to the events of the day. As they unfolded, the safety car pulled in, I think, after 5 laps, the end of lap 5, and racing resumed. And
they did a clean lap.
They did a clean
from
lap.
The start. Lap 6 was a clean lap.
And all seemed... And it was dry, it was bright.
Senna leading Schumacher.
It was a great sporting contest. Yep. And perhaps we all had right to dare to hope that normal service was being resumed, but it was not, because that was the end of lap 5, and lap 6 was a clean lap, as you say, Richard, but then lap 7. Lap 7, it happened. It being that Senna... Well, he attempted to take the left-hander at Tamburello, which was, of course, a super-fast corner in those days. I mean, it's the same corner that we talk about in the last episode. You know, multiple big accidents had happened there in the past. Anyway, Ayrton's Williams left the track and struck the outside concrete retaining wall, which was not very far from the track. The runoff was not big, at what was later reported to be 131 miles per hour. And again, I've used this word already, but it was a truly sickening crash. And I think everybody watching on television quite quickly knew that, you know, it was an extremely serious one as well. And if you remember, Murray Walker's almost funereal tones were a telltale sign that he thought that too.
Yeah. It was a very, very strange thing to be watching on TV when you saw this. You know, it was perfectly normal lap, and then suddenly, I remember there was a long shot of the exit from Tamburello, and you saw this projectile just going whoosh straight across the screen in front of you, and he'd gone into Tamburello at 190 and hit the wall. at 130. So it was moving very rapidly. And it wasn't like one of those crashes where, somebody loses the rear end and spins or the car is behaving crazily. It just went straight in. And again...
And by the way, Senna was the best. And Tamburello may have been a fast corner, but it wasn't a corner that was, a white knuckle, sort the men out from the boys' corner in the same way.
Shouldn't have been. No, it wasn't.
Which made everybody think it must have been a car fault rather than a driver fault. Anyway, sorry, I interrupted.
Yes, that's true. And then, of course, the marshals and the safety workers gathered around the car, and you had slightly the same thing that you had with Ratzenberger. They didn't really know what to do. Senna was motionless in the cockpit. And of course, there was absolute horror, and there was a helicopter shot. Helicopter shots zooming in on the car and the cockpit. And eventually Sid Watkins and the medical car got there, and the medical workers, and surrounded Senna.
If I remember, just don't forget where you were in what you were saying. Yeah. But I remember BBC decided to cut away from that. But Rai, the host broadcaster, the Italian host broadcaster, lingered.
Yeah.
But the BBC pulled away. And then, as now, when the cameras pull away, it's always a bad sign.
It is. And of course, there's always a debate about what should the cameras and what should the TV director be doing. If it's a catastrophe, should you be showing it? As a reporter, generally, I feel you should show it, I have to say. But anyway, nobody really knew what was happening. Sid Watkins was bent over him. Only Sid really knew what was happening at that point. And of course, they called for the air ambulance. And they removed him from the cockpit very carefully, put him on a stretcher. They had to take out the steering wheel, and which had the shaft had broken, and they pulled that out to get him out of the very tight cockpit. Took him away in the air ambulance to the hospital in Bologna, and of course there was that incredibly poignant shot of the helicopter going up,
never forget it,
above the trees slowly, and then going away, and you thought, is he dead? What is, are they going to, be able to do anything?
And as we've said already, he hadn't been declared dead because of the legal situation in Italy. The death can't be declared. But actually, that poignant footage of the helicopter rising up and flying away was containing a dead Ayrton Senna.
Yes,
really.
Because what had happened was that when the car went into the wall, the right front wheel went in to the concrete wall and broke the suspension, and a piece of wishbone or suspension part metal came and pierced his helmet.
And went into his head.
And had a very, unsurvivable head injury, which Sid Watkins, as a neurosurgeon, would have known straight away. No doubt about that.
Straight away. Anyway, we didn't know that at the time. As you say, perhaps Sid did. Certainly Sid did, but almost nobody else did. And just 37 minutes after that shunt, which is actually quite a short time, so we're up to about 5 to 3, 2:55 p.m., I think, the race was restarted. And it's, at that time, although everyone was aware that it was a serious crash, almost everyone, including the drivers, because sometimes the drivers don't know as much as everybody else because they're in the car. And they were in the dark about what had happened. I mean, Martin Brundle said later that he was told on the grid that Senna was okay, can you imagine? And a lot of the drivers had seen Senna's head move in the cockpit and therefore had assumed, or at least hoped against hope, that he was okay. So the drivers didn't really know. And the show goes on. The show must go on is the famous phrase, and it did go on. And do you think it should have done, Richard? I think you're going to say, yes, it should.
I suppose you honour history by saying, yes, it should. Races had always gone on, despite many, many fatalities through the history of motor racing. Even in Formula One after the war, you can think of Luigi Musso and Peter Collins and Lorenzo Bandini and others. And the races continued. In sports car racing, at Le Mans in 1955, 80 spectators were killed opposite the pits and, early in the race. and the race continued to its finish because that was what happened. Now, attitudes...
And even more recently, though, 20 years after Imola, 2014, Jules Bianchi. Now, he had a fatal accident. He wasn't declared death at the scene then either, but racing resumed.
Yes, you wonder now what would happen in 2024 if, heaven forbid, and touching this wooden desk.
And so am I.
Anything similar were to happen. I tend to think racing nowadays would be suspended and the race meeting would be called off.
I probably, and we're getting off the subject in a way, but I think you're right. I think that is the reaction that probably would be observed. And I think the drivers, the teams, governing body and the commercial rights holder would all probably go along with that. You might get the odd driver.
Yeah. Of course, you have to remember that Senna hadn't been declared dead.
No,
so,
exactly.
There was, in that sense, no reason to...
Any more than Bianchi had.
No.
Yes.
No.
Anyway, let's go back to our narrative.
Yeah.
There was one more horrible thing happened, wasn't there? Lap 48, Richard.
Yes. Michele Alboreto, who was driving for Minardi that year, came into the pits, and as he came out, he'd had his tyres changed. As he came out, his right rear wheel came loose from the car and struck 4 mechanics, 2 Ferrari mechanics and 2 from Lotus, and they all needed hospital treatment. And still, the race carried on.
In a way, it was carnage. It was carnage. But in the end, after all of that carnage, Michael Schumacher crossed the line in first place, and Nicola Larini in the Ferrari and Mika Häkkinen in the McLaren, completing what ended up being a very miserable, dismal and somber podium. It's worth saying it was poor Larini's only Formula One podium, of course, because he was a super sub that race. He I think for a couple of races he super subbed, didn't he? Was it for a Alesi?
Alesi, yeah.
Yes, for Alesi. And it was his only podium. And as soon as he had achieved it, I think we all knew that no one would ever remember it. I know we're remembering it now, and rightly so. But sadly for Nicola, who was a good and underrated driver, it hasn't been remembered. Anyway, if you recall, the drivers went through the post-race press conference, and I've used the word already, but a somber Schumacher said, "I can't feel satisfied. I can't feel happy." And I think he later said that he seriously considered quitting the sport at that time. Whether that was true or not, I don't know. I'm not saying it was untrue, but it isn't necessarily...
It might have crossed his mind,
yes.
Because Senna was such a symbol, and, people always say, and it's absolutely right, that it was like Jim Clark being killed. It was the one that nobody expected to go in that way. So that might have crossed Schumacher as a young driver at that point. Fleetingly, he might have thought.
And realizing that the person he wanted to beat and emulate, both emulate and beat, he was Senna.
Yep.
And of course, I don't think he actually knew for sure at that time when he said those words that Senna was dead. Did he? Or perhaps he'd had the tip off.
At the press conference, I don't think anybody knew for certain.
Not definitively, though. I think a lot of people thought this is not going to have a good outcome.
No. In fact, nobody knew for sure that Senna was dead until the official announcement came. And that was 2 hours and 20 minutes after the end of the race.
Yeah.
And that feels like a good time for our final ad break.
Absolutely.
Matt, can you remember where you were when you heard the news that Senna was dead?
Well, I can, and thereby hangs a tale, actually, because I wasn't at the race, as I've already said. I didn't go to all the races in 1994, and I didn't go to that race. And I was doing something very, very different. My grandmother, now dead, of course, her father, just bear with me on this little wending down memory lane, if you don't mind, old boy. But her father, therefore my great-grandfather, was a lieutenant in the British Army in the First World War. And he had been killed at the Battle of the Somme in 1916, decorated for valor. And she, at that time, was 4 years old. She was 4 years old in 1916. And now she revealed to me, aged 82, that she had never, ever visited his grave. He was buried in northern France, Abbeville, actually, near Amiens, in one of those War Graves Commission, enormous and very depressing, but extraordinary to visit. You know, just gravestone after gravestone after gravestone. You've probably been.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Anyway, so I said, Gran, do you want to come? Just jump in the car. The Channel Tunnel had... no, it hadn't. It hadn't. We went by ferry. And she said, oh, darling, of course not. No, I can't go. I'm 82. I said, you can. Just get in the back of the car. I'll drive you there. And we did. And we drove from where she lived in West Sussex, and we drove to Abbeville. And, of course, we're talking about 1994. There was no social media. There was no internet. We were in France. The radio was in French. We didn't put it on. We talked. We got to Abbeville, where she stood and paid respects to her father, who she had last seen when he walked out of their West Sussex cottage to go to war when she was 4. And 78 years later, it was very moving. There she was standing there in tears, paying respects to him. Anyway, that was the Sunday. That was where we were on the Sunday. And then we stayed the night in a pension and drove back. And it was only on the ferry. It was only on the ferry when we were parked up where the cars park in the hold, or whatever you call it, the car deck, I think. And as we all assembled and got in our cars as the ferry came towards Dover or Folkestone, can't remember which one, this a man and his son were in the car next to us, and they put their radio on. Maybe they were trying to catch up with news or sports news or something. And I overheard it. And I overheard, it was 24 hours later, I hadn't been aware. And I overheard the discussion of the tragedy of Imola and questions asked about the viability of motor racing. And I was just, Gran, sorry, be quiet, I have to listen to this, Gran. Mm-hmm. And we listened carefully, and it became clear that they were talking about a death. And I was thinking, I wonder which death. Not daring to hope, because any death was, of course, a tragedy. But then when it said Senna, I thought, no, it can't be Senna. It can't be. And I turned to the two chaps, man and his son, grown-up son, and said, did you hear that Ayrton Senna was killed? They said, oh yeah, Ayrton Senna was killed at Imola yesterday. I said, oh my goodness. That was my memory of how I found out 24 hours later.
Yeah, well, it was shattering. I was working for The Independent on Sunday at the time, and events that happen on Sunday aren't much use to a Sunday paper. So I hadn't gone to Imola. I'd been to Interlagos to the first race, missed Aida. But the priority that weekend, I'm sorry to say, was the Rugby League Cup final at Wembley on the Saturday, which I'd been to, and which I remember nothing about. I have no idea who the two teams playing in it were or what happened, because any memory of that was wiped out by what happened the next day when I was at my sister's in Oxfordshire for Sunday lunch. And of course I took myself away from the lunch table to watch the race and saw what happened unfold, with, of course, gathering horror. And, back to Imola, the reaction in the paddock was clearly one of complete shock. It seemed, afterwards it was obvious that many drivers had just wanted to get away afterwards as soon as possible. Nobody could believe that Senna, of all people, could have bought it because he'd seemed invincible. And, for some of the younger drivers on the grid, he was 33. For the guys in their early 20s, he was their idol. They'd grown up watching him winning races and dominating. And he was the kind of figurehead and the example. And to someone like Gerhard Berger, who went to the hospital and saw him there, he was a great friend.
Yeah, and there was an outpouring of grief in the paddock, but also all around the world, because he was the sport's biggest superstar by an order of magnitude back then. I mean, he's right up there now, but he was then. He transcended Formula One in a sense. His fame transcended Formula One. It was front page news, not back page news. It was front page news everywhere. And, I'm going to ask you about this, Richard, because we all know there were 3 days of national mourning in Brazil. It's still, I think, one of the largest public funerals that there has been in modern times. And you were there.
Yes, on the Monday morning, my sports editor at The Independent on Sunday rang up and said he'd realised the scale of this disaster and what it meant. And he said, you better get on the plane to Sao Paulo, as there would obviously be some kind of state funeral. So I spent Monday making the arrangements and went off, flew to Sao Paulo via Lisbon and got there at about just after dawn on the morning that Senna's plane was arriving. The plane with the coffin carrying his body was arriving from Paris, where it had been taken from, I guess, Bologna to Paris and then Paris to Sao Paulo. So I landed just before that plane and went through immigration. The plane landed. I went out of the airport, found a taxi, and waited by the side of the road. And what we saw was that the coffin had been taken off the plane. They'd cleared the business class compartment for it. It was taken off, and it was put on a fire engine, on the sort of open bed at the back of a fire engine, surrounded by an honor guard of soldiers. And it was driven, and there were official cars too, and it was driven the 20 miles into the center of Sao Paulo on this sort of improvised hearse, followed by, hundreds and hundreds of vehicles of all kinds, including my taxi we joined in too. And there were, I remember a big truck with a Brazilian flag the size of a house was part of this thing. But there were broken down old Jeeps and all kinds of things, and people on motorbikes, and with many people with the Brazilian flag and a lot of the cars had one person holding a flag out of the window, as Senna had done when he'd won a race. Do you remember?
I do.
He always kept a Brazilian flag in the cockpit, and he would do his lap of honor waving the flag. And I realized that when that was a dramatic thing to do, but I realized when I got to Brazil and I saw all these people doing it, what it had meant to Brazil for him to do it, that it was such a gesture of solidarity with the people. And it brought him the adoration of the whole country, not just the F1 fans, the middle classes, the rich, but the people who lived in the favelas, the shanty towns, everybody. He was a symbol, particularly when the Brazil football team was having a bad time and there was no real Pele at that moment. So Senna actually was it. And then we got to the monumental hall where the coffin was to rest while people could pass by it, and the family and other VIPs could go and pay their respects to it. And the queue was 3 miles long.
Wow.
Tens and tens and tens of thousands of people. And they'd come from all over Brazil already by that point. I remember talking to people, who'd come from the south, from all over, and all kinds of people, many young people. There were the VIPs, the family, Frank Williams, Ron Dennis, all the people who'd been involved in his career. They were all there too, but much more moving were these ordinary people coming to pay their respects. And I remember a lot of the young people, especially the girls, they had their faces painted with stripes, the Brazilian colors, the green and the gold, but also a black stripe in between those two for mourning. And that was a very, very moving thing to have seen. So that was, that took a long time for people to pass by. And there was quite a lot of, at one point, there was crowding and the police had to come in and sort people out a bit. But that was kind of unforgettable. And it reminded me of the only other very big funeral I'd been to in 1981, which was Bob Marley's funeral in Jamaica. Funeral ceremony took place in Kingston in the National Gymnasium, and the country came to a halt, and then his body was taken all the way up from the south of the island, up to the north to the village where he'd been born, where he was buried. And, the roadside was crowded, just as they had been in Sao Paulo. People hanging off bridges and flyovers, and the side of the road, 10 deep with people all the way from the airport to the place where the coffin was taken. And then the next day, the funeral, which was another journey, because that was several kilometers to Marumbi, the park in Marumbi, where the cemetery for kind of well-off people is. And that, again, that was going up the hill behind the coffin to the cemetery was like, it reminded me of Alpe d'Huez Day and the Tour de France. It was just absolutely crammed up this narrow hillside road with people crying and shouting and waving flags and banners, and an amazing, amazing sight.
Absolutely. I mean, I was going to say privilege, but of course very poignant and sad.
Oh, it was a great privilege to be able to see that, to be able to see it, and a country of 250 million people saying goodbye to their hero. And then the funeral itself was a much more intimate affair. There were, I can't remember, maybe 50 or 100 people gathered, the family and very, very close people. Including
some Formula One figures, quite a lot of Formula One figures.
Oh, yes.
The pallbearers were all Formula One drivers, I think, were they not?
They were. There were Berger and Alboreto and Prost and Boutsen and Damon.
Yeah.
Rubens, yeah, a lot of Brazilians, Rubens, Moreno, Maurizio Gugelmin, Raul Bozel, the Fittipaldi family, Emerson and Wilson and Christian. And that was an extraordinary thing to see all those. Some of them wearing sunglasses to sort of hide their tears, no doubt about that. Jackie Stewart, who represented an earlier era.
Not Bernie Ecclestone and not Max Mosley.
Or Max Mosley, no, they were told to keep away
yes.
by the
Max
family.
went to Ratzenberger's funeral, to be fair to him.
He did. I think they both wanted to go. Bernie went to San Paulo, but Leonardo Senna, Ayrton's brother, asked him to stay away because the feeling in Brazil was very anti-F1.
Yeah.
They felt, rightly or wrongly, that Senna had been killed by Formula One and killed by a lack of sufficient attention to safety precautions. And for that, they held Mosley and Ecclestone directly responsible. So it was wise of them to stay away.
Probably was. You mentioned Adrienne, Richard. She wasn't at Imola, but she was at the funeral. Tell me about that.
Yes, she was. Actually, the night before the race, when she was in Faro at their home in Portugal, Ayrton had called her twice. Once he had the kind of conversation that he had with Sid Watkins, saying, "I don't want to race tomorrow." And he'd been very distressed. And then the call had ended. But then he rang her back later when he'd been doing some thinking and said, "Well, I am going to race it. It'll be all right." And the last thing he said to her was, "Meet me at Faro Airport at 8:30 tomorrow night. I'm looking forward to seeing you." And anyway, she was at the funeral. It was very interesting and very saddening, actually, to see how she was treated, because the family didn't see her as the official widow, if you like. She and Ayrton had been together, I think, for 13 months, and they were planning to get married. But the family did not approve. And so although she was there for the ceremony, when the official cars left, she wasn't allowed into the family car. And Viviane, Ayrton's sister, left in the family car with Shusha, who'd been his girlfriend before. And Adrian had to find other means of getting away.
Wow, what a sad little story.
It was a sort of sad postscript to the whole thing, really.
Yeah. You mentioned Emerson Fittipaldi, who was, as you say, he was one of the pallbearers. Now, I've written a book with Emerson, and we've talked a lot about this and many other important things that have happened in his life and in his career. And of course, the death of Ayrton Senna was one of those things for Emerson. And at that time, we were saying where we were, and I think everybody remembers. If you're into motor racing, everybody remembers where they were when they heard the news. Well, I'll tell you where Emerson was. Emerson was testing a Penske Mercedes IndyCar at Michigan. That's what he was doing. And his crew chief radioed him and said, "Come into the pits." And straight away he was surprised because he'd just begun a full tanks run. And so he queried it. "Why are you bringing me in? Is there something the matter with the car?" And the crew chief just said, "Emo, just come in. Box, box, box." So he came in, stopped the car, got out, and said, "What's the matter?" And none of the Penske mechanics spoke. But the crew chief beckoned him to the phone, and he had the phone held in his outstretched hand, and said, "Emo, your wife wants to speak to you." And Emerson said, "My heart turned to ice." I mean, his immediate thought, not surprisingly, was that something terrible must have happened to one of their kids. But he took the phone. And his wife said 2 words. She just said, "It's Ayrton." And that was it. That was all that was needed to say or to be said. Because, of course, Emerson knew that Ayrton was racing at Imola that day. And Emerson loved Ayrton. Absolutely loved him. 2 proud, passionate Brazilian Formula One world champions, multiple Formula One world champions. And when Emerson put the phone down, I mean, already in tears by his own recollection, he looked at the Penske guys, and they knew how monumental it was. They were tearful too. Don't forget, Ayrton had tested a Penske IndyCar at Phoenix the year before, and by the way, had been brilliant in it. And Emerson had facilitated that and was there at the time. So the Penske guys knew Ayrton, didn't just know him, liked him, admired him, revered him. "I can't carry on," said Emerson. And he flew back to Miami that evening, and he rang Roger Penske, and Roger Penske understood. I think everybody's got one of those stories, and Emerson's is particularly, I find, poignant. You mentioned the grave at Morumbi. Now, obviously, I wasn't at the funeral, but I have, in subsequent years, more recently, visited the grave when I've been at the Brazilian Grand Prix at Interlagos. And it's actually, it's a rather pretty, I would say beautiful municipal park. As you say, very well tended, and, graves for people who've got a few bob, if you don't mind me saying. But what sets it apart from what we're used to, certainly in the UK and perhaps in Europe, where graves all look slightly different, and you can design, if your mother dies or your father dies, you have a debate about how shall we make the headstone look and what shall we write on it. Anyway, they're not like that. They're small, flush to the grass. They don't stand up. They're flush to the grass and small, probably about a foot square, and quite hard to find, actually, therefore. And I remember going with I've been a couple of times, once with mates at McLaren and once with mates at Aston Martin. And finally you find it, but you have to search it out. I thought there might be a group of people already there because, of course, I've been at Brazilian Grand Prix time, and perhaps other people might have had the same idea, other team people or fans. But no, there was no one there. And I can't speak Portuguese, but I do know what the message on the gravestone says if you translate it into English. And it says, "Nothing can separate me from the love of God."
And that's all it says, isn't it? It's
Yes.
just Ayrton Senna da Silva and his dates.
Yes.
And just that.
And that little line in Portuguese.
Yep.
It's very poignant, very spare.
Yep.
And this small, it's no bigger than any of the other graves. Anyway, of course, Emerson is a very religious man. And like Ayrton, like Rubens, like most Brazilian sportsmen and women, in fact, but Ayrton was and Emerson is. And he said to me actually not long ago, he said, I noted it down. He said these words, "I feel Ayrton's presence every day. I pray for him often. One day I know we'll meet again." It's quite poignant, isn't it?
Very. There were two Brazilian drivers who didn't go to the funeral, and for very different reasons. One was Nelson Piquet, who, of course, was the Brazilian F1 hero immediately before Ayrton, and clearly resented having been usurped, having his status taken away by Ayrton, and said a lot of nasty things about him, called him, before he, when he was still alive, called him a Sao Paulo taxi driver, which was a kind of insult of somebody from Rio de Janeiro to someone from Sao Paulo.
I mean, quite in character for Nelson Piquet.
Yes, indeed. And there were a few other things he said that were unpleasant. So he said he wasn't going to be a hypocrite. Fair enough. And go to the funeral and pretend to have liked him. And the other was Chico Serra, who'd been with Ayrton when he began his career in single-seaters in England. And I think Serra had been helpful to him. And they'd been close. And then Senna's career had gone on. And Serra kind of stalled once he got to F1. He didn't really make it. And I don't think he felt anything, felt any jealousy at all towards Ayrton. But he didn't go to the funeral, he said, because suddenly when Senna died, there were a lot of people pretending to have liked him, pretending to have known him really well, pretending to be more moved than they really were. And he didn't want to be part of that. So I suppose fair enough for that too. Going back to the graveyard, my last memory of the funeral service is a couple of planes from the Brazilian version of the Red Arrows flying overhead and letting out smoke and inscribing that double S in the very blue sky above the cemetery as the funeral ceremony was ending, which was a very moving thing also to see. So, Matt...
We've nearly made each other cry, mate.
Well, it's... There you go. It's a very sad thing to reflect on.
It is.
And 30 years later, how do you look back on it? Do you... Have your emotions changed over time? Have they diminished? Or
Well, evidently not, because here we've been talking about it, and I think we've both become quite affected by some of the stories that we've told, even though we know them. So I think, I think it is a remarkably emotional chain of events. And, Formula One lost its biggest and brightest star. And I'm going to move away just from the poignant elements of it, and I'm going to chuck a theory at you, Richard. I think... and I'm going to posit it as a possibility. I'm not saying I think it definitely would have happened, but just bear with me on this. Damon Hill nearly won the World Championship in 1994. I mean, as near as damn it. But for a dodgy move by Schumacher, he would have won it in Adelaide. The first three races of that year had shown very clearly that Senna had his measure by some margin in terms of pace. So I'm assuming, bear with me on this, I'm assuming that Ayrton would have won the 1994 championship. Damon should have won the 1995 championship. It wasn't his best year. And I'm assuming that Ayrton would have won that one too. Damon did win the 1996 World Championship, so I'm assuming Ayrton would have won that one as well. And then I think Ayrton would not have been sacked and would not have had to go and find an Arrows drive as Damon did. So he would have won the 1997 championship instead of Jacques Villeneuve. You can see where I'm going here, but I've got another twist to this. But because I think at that point, Ron Dennis would have said, Ayrton, come back home. McLaren's your home, and I have hired Adrian Newey. I've hired the man who's won you all these world championships. Come back home and win some more for me. I think he would have won Häkkinen's 2 world championships in 1998 and 1999. And as the cherry on the top of the cake, Häkkinen was well in contention for the 2000 world championship, which of course was won by Michael Schumacher, the first Drivers' Championship Ferrari for Ferrari for 21 years, and Ayrton would have been a fit 40. And I think in 2000 he would have won his, I've counted them up, 10th Formula One World Championship. What do you reckon?
I'm going to harden my heart, Matt, and say there are no ifs in sport.
You hard man.
What happened, happened. And, he got his 3 championships, but he'll be remembered for much more than that, much more than anything statistical. In fact, with the exception of Stirling Moss, I can't think of a single racing driver whose reputation rests less on statistics than on actually who he was.
And I don't disagree with any of that. And by the way, if you're a Damon Hill fan or a Michael Schumacher fan or a Mika Hakkinen fan, and you're upset with my extrapolations, I apologize. It's just an extrapolation. So look, I think that may be a good place to say. And colossally, that's history. So thank you for joining us for this rather poignant trip down memory lane, which we hope you have, I'm not going to say enjoyed, but perhaps it's resonated with you, whether you remember the events we spoke about or not.
And if you think this episode might be of interest to someone you know, please do pass it on. We've got a great listening community already, but we'd love to keep on growing it.
We would. And in our next episode, we'll be discussing the fallout from Imola 1994, including what happened at the inquest, how safety was improved, and more. So do be sure to tune in for that. But in the meantime, if you want to get in touch with us, you can drop us a line on podcasts@the-race.com, or you can drop Richard or me a message on X, the platform formerly known as Twitter. I'm at the Bish F1, and Richard is at R. Williams 1947.
And until next time, goodbye.
Goodbye.
And colossally, that's history.
The Athletic.